This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. All right. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us on Zoom tonight for our first fully Zoom shiur in the winter months. Parshas Lecha. So obviously, I want to discuss Abraham and some of what's going on over there. Now, let me start with two questions. All right, they're pretty basic questions, and one of them at least I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of us have thought about. And hopefully we'll see two different approaches to answer the questions. And I think it will be a very fundamental discussion also about a very crucial issue. When I do Zoom things, you generally either have company or you hear kids yelling, just heads up. Okay, so question number one is a pretty glaring question. The Ramban asks this in his commentary at the beginning of Lecha, which is that the Torah just shows up out of the blue, right? We know nothing about this guy Abraham. I mean, in Parshas Noach, he was introduced very briefly, right? That Terach, that his father was Terach, and it said the first leg of their journey. I talked about his brother dying, his father dying. So we do know a little bit of information about him, but we basically, we don't know anything about who this guy is. How great he is, how I don't know, what a giant, what a spiritual giant he is. And then suddenly, boom, the Torah shows up and says, Lech Lecha, that God shows him to be the founder of the Jewish people, right? So there seems to be a whole prehistory missing over here. How did this guy get chosen? What's special about Abraham? Who is he? What did God see in him? Right? None of this is addressed by the Torah. It seems to be skipping this whole era of what made him into the person that God chose. And then suddenly, boom, the Torah just says that God chose him, and God said, you go and you're gonna go start the Jewish people. And of course, the whole journey of the Jewish people is beginning in this week's Parsha. All right, so this seems to be a major omission that the Torah just jumps into it, and it doesn't give us any background about how Abraham was chosen. All right, that's the first question. Now, the second question, and you'll already see how these questions are gonna dovetail together. All right, the second question is that there's a very famous story in the Medrash, which Rashi quotes at the end of last week's Parsha. Right, so at the end of Parshas Noach, again in those few psukim where it describes Abraham. So one of the phrases that it uses is Vayamas Haran al pnei Terach aviv b'orkastim. That Haran, who's Abraham's brother, died in his father's lifetime in Orkastim. Okay, so Haran, the brother, died. So Rashi quotes a very famous medrash that not only did Haran die while his father was still alive, but he actually died because of his father. All right, so what does that mean? Right? How did Haran die because of his father? So Rashi tells the famous story that Haran reported his son Abraham. Right? He reported him to the authorities that he was smashing idols and he was disagreeing with paganism. Right? That he was questioning the idolatry. The local religion was some form of idolatry, and Haran reported to the authorities that his son Abraham no longer believed in idolatry and that he had destroyed the idols, and the authorities brought him in. They judged him to be killed. Right? He was a heretic in their eyes, so they said they were going to kill him. So they threw him into this fire, and Abraham survived. Now Haran, his brother, was on the fence. He wasn't sure who to follow, he wasn't sure which group to side with. So he decided, if Abraham survives, then I'm going to join him. And if he dies, then I'll join the idolaters, the pagans. So when Abraham survived, he decided to join Abraham's group. So when the idolaters said to him, whose side are you on? Do you believe in one God or many gods? So he said, I believe in Abraham's God. I agree with Abraham. So they threw him in the fire, and then he died. All right, because he wasn't worthy, right? He wasn't on the level of being saved. Abraham was on a much higher level. His brother was just sort of, he was just following, grasping onto his coattails, but he was just a follower. He wasn't really a believer. So therefore he died in the fire. So Terach, not intentionally, but unintentionally, Terach caused his son Haran to be killed. So that's why the Torah says that Haran was killed when Terach, his father, in his father's lifetime, because his father had led to his being killed. Okay, that's the medrash that Rashi quotes. And according to that, the word Or-Kasdim, right? It says that they lived in the city of Or-Kasdim. So that's actually a reference. The Or is the fire, right? Or is light, which could be a reference to fire. So it's not actually a city, right? It wasn't called Or-Kasdim, but it's a reference to the miracle that happened there, that Abraham was saved from the Or, from the fire. Okay, then Rashi quotes that there's another explanation from Menachem. Menachem was one of the great grammarians of the medieval period. Menachem said that the word Or in the Torah can sometimes mean a valley, not light. It sometimes means a valley. So Or Kasdim was the valley of Kasdim. So that was the name of the place. So it was a city name, right? Or Kasdim, according to Menachem, was a city name. But again, according to the Medrash, the Or Kasdim is not a city name. It's a reference to this great miracle that happened, that Abraham was saved. Okay, so our second question is, why didn't the Torah explicitly write this story? Right? We have so many wonderful miracles that are mentioned in the Torah. Why is this miracle, why is this story, which is a major event that Abraham was saved from the fire, why is that not recorded in the Torah? Right? Later on in the Navi, in the book of Daniel, so three of his friends, Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah, are thrown into a lion's pit. I think they're actually also thrown into a fire. Now I can't remember. They're definitely thrown into the lion's den, but I think there was also a fire there. And they're saved, and the Navi makes a big deal about this. So why didn't the Torah make a big deal about Abraham being thrown into the fire? Right? I'm pretty sure there's another story of someone being thrown into a fire and being saved. But either way, okay, those are our two questions. All right, number one, why don't we get any biography of Abraham before he's chosen to lead the Jewish people or to found the Jewish people? And number two, why is this great miracle of the saving from the fire mentioned in the Medrash, but it's not mentioned in the Torah? Okay, so now what I want to look at right now are two different approaches to answer these questions. And we're going to see that there's a major difference, how we think about Judaism, really, between these. Let me start with, there's a cute little poem that people say, which goes like this: how odd of God to choose the Jews, not so odd, the Jews chose God. All right, now it's a cute little poem. It's like a little rhyme, a little ditty, but it's actually a very profound question, right? Who chose who? Did God choose the Jews, or did the Jews choose God, right? Who started the process over here? All right, that's a very profound question, and we're going to see that this is actually a debate between the Ramban and the Maharal. So two of our most important commentators have a debate about precisely this issue. And again, this is probably something that we've thought about. I'm not sure that these are going to be new ideas, but I think it will be good to see how our classic commentators formulate it and how they get it from the Torah. All right, so let's begin with the Ramban. Okay, the Ramban says that these two questions are going to answer each other. Okay, so let's start with the second question that we asked. Why doesn't the Torah mention that Abraham was saved from the fire? So the Ramban says, first of all, that don't think that the Medrash is wrong about this story, okay? Because it's very, very historically accurate, the story that the Medrash is telling. Okay, so we shouldn't think that the rabbis are telling a story which is implausible, that probably didn't happen, and that's why it's not in the Torah, right? He quotes that there are some commentators, for example, the Ibn Ezra, who's very focused on the words of the Torah. So he actually questions this whole story. He says, who says for sure that this story happened? Because we don't have it in the Torah. It's just a tradition, an oral tradition. But the Ramban says, no, don't question it, because it's very, very likely that this story did happen. Okay, why? So the Ramban says because there's a lot of extra biblical evidence. There's a lot of evidence, historical evidence, outside of the Torah that would indicate that this story is plausible. Okay, and he goes through some of the geography of the land of Israel, some of the cities that are there, and he maps out how Abraham's journey would have made sense in those cities and what we know about the people that live there. So he goes through a whole geography to make sense of the story. But I want to kind of skip that. I want to go to something else. I want to go to the last part of his discussion. He says that the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim, all right, so the Rambam in his main philosophical book So the Rambam was very, very well read. All right, he had read like a huge amount of non-Jewish books, philosophy books, history books. I mean, he really knew his stuff. So the Rambam quotes from some manuscript that he, or some book that he had of pagan history. Okay, so this is not a Jewish book. This is a pagan historical book. And in that historical book, it tells a story about a guy named Avraham who began disagreeing with idolatry. He rejected the pagan idolatry. So he believed in, right? He started arguing with the religion of the day. And the king threw him in prison. Okay, and then he left the prison. Okay, so this story appears in a non-Jewish book that the Rambam had access to, which he quotes in his philosophy book. So says the Ramban, again, we're going from the Rambam to the Ramban in his commentary on the Torah. Says the Ramban, the fact that we find evidence for this similar story in a non-Jewish book indicates that it probably happened. Okay, he says maybe, in other words, it could be that it was a little different, right? It could be that Abraham, they just let him out of prison and he left. In other words, the Medrash tells a more dramatic story that Abraham was thrown in the fire and he survived. So that's what we would call an open miracle, right? It's clear that God is running the show. Maybe it wasn't so dramatic, right? Maybe according to the non-Jewish source, maybe Abraham was just thrown in prison and then they let him out. But says the Ramban, either way, that's a massive miracle. Because what are the chances that some ancient pagan king would let a guy out of prison and not kill him for rejecting the gods, right? Normally they would just kill him. So either way, whether Abraham was just let out of prison or whether he survived the fire, this was a miracle. It was either a hidden miracle or an open miracle, but it was clearly a miracle. Okay, so now we have evidence that Abraham survived his original encounter with the idolaters through a miracle. Says the Ramban, so it makes sense that the Medrash's version, again, is basically true. Okay, now let me just add in one thing before I continue here, which is we now know that a lot of the books the Rambam quotes are forgeries or they're not real books. In other words, these are not 1,000-year-old books that really record the real history. So again, the Rambam didn't know that in his day and age. They didn't have large universities with specialists that study manuscripts and all sorts of experts in this stuff. So the Rambam did the best he could, right? Whatever manuscripts he got, he studied and he thought that they were accurate. He thought that they were, that they were what they said they were. But we now know we have some of these manuscripts. Some of them were lost, but we basically know the way these manuscripts went. That a lot of them were very, very, not authoritative, right? They were not accurate what they were saying, and people would just write these forgeries to try to sell them and popularize them. So I don't think we should use the Rambam's source as a real source, but I do think it tells us something interesting about the Rambam and the Ramban, both of them. All right, this is not my point, and I've seen other people make this point, but both of them were open to taking historical sources and using them to help understand the Tanakh. All right, and I think that's just an interesting thing. That's a big debate nowadays. Should we use history to try to understand the Tanakh or not? But the Rambam and the Ramban both seemed open to that idea, even though their sources were not accurate. But nowadays we have much better history. We have large universities with professors, historians. We have much better access to history. So so on some level we can use it to try to recreate the world of the Tanakh. Okay, now let's go back to the Ramban's analysis. So now the Ramban says, why did the non-Jews in their history not mention the miracle of the fire? So the Ramban says, well, you know what? It's their history, right? They can write whatever they want. They decide what they want to put in their own history. And they didn't want to put in that miracle because probably, he says, they thought that Abraham was like a magician, right? When Moshe comes, right, to Pharaoh to do all the plagues initially, so there's magicians, right? There's these black magic guys who do all sorts of things to nature. So the Ramban says, you know what? Probably when Abraham survived the fire, the ancient idolaters thought that he's just a magician, and they didn't believe in God, right? They never believed in God. They never accepted the one God. They remained idolaters. So that's why they never put it down in their book, because they didn't think it was relevant. Says the Ramban, why didn't the Torah record the miracle. Okay, now let's come to our question that we began with. Why didn't the Torah record this miracle? So the Ramban says for the same reason, because it's the Torah's version of history and they can put whatever they want, right? Hashem doesn't need to, God can choose whatever he wants to put in the Torah's history. And he didn't want to record this story. Why? So the Ramban says something very, very interesting. He says because God did not want to tell the whole story about how there were idolaters and what they believed and how they tried to kill Abraham. He didn't want to get into this whole history of paganism. It's his Torah, it's his beautiful Torah, and it's perfect. And he didn't want to mess it up with the words of all sorts of ancient idolaters and all their crazy ideas about how there's multiple gods. So God decided, I'm going to skip this whole story. It's not worth it to me to record it in the Torah because all it's going to do is like mess up my perfect Torah by having all these crazy guys recorded in there who believe in idols. Okay, so that's why God omitted it from the Torah. But even though God omitted it from the Torah, but he did hint at it. Okay, so one of the hints we saw earlier, right? He said that Haran died on his father's like face, right? So that indicates that his father played a role in his death. That's how Rashi hinted at it. The Ramban says there's another hint because later on Hashem says to Abraham, Ani Hashem asher hotzesicha me'or kasdim. I am Hashem who took you out of Or Kasdim. Now, that's an unusual word. He should have said lekachticha, right? I took you. Lekachticha would mean I took you. What does hotzesicha mean? Right? Hotzesicha implies something more than I just took you out of Or Kasdim, like I gave you directions to leave. It implies I saved you, right? I took you out, like I saved you from the furnace. So God is hinting in the Torah with using this word hotzesicha, that I took you instead of lekachticha. He's hinting at the miracle. Okay, so that's the Ramban's approach to this issue. Basically, that God did not want to put this story in the Torah because he didn't want to have to write what the idolater said. He's not interested in recording the idolater's viewpoint, so he just omitted the whole story, but he did hint at it. Okay, now let me say a few things over here. First of all, the Ramban has at least another major answer. He has two major answers to this question. He comes back to this question over and over again because a lot of times the rabbis will add something that it doesn't say in the Torah, and the Ramban will explain why it's not in the Torah. All right, so maybe at some other point, another week, we'll discuss more, or we'll discuss another approach of his. But right now, I just want to focus on this approach, which has to do with Abraham specifically. Okay, now let me say something else over here, because many times the Torah does talk about idolaters, right? Let's say, I just mentioned with Moshe's whole fight with the magicians in Egypt, right? It keeps quoting what they said. So what does that mean that the Torah doesn't want to quote anything which is not true when it does quote people who say things that are not true, right? The magicians in Egypt are not true, but the Torah still quotes them. So why couldn't it quote the idolaters who fought with Abraham? So in the Ramban's commentators, there's two ways to explain this. One is from a commentary called the Sham Derech, all right, or the I don't know, Shame Derech, I don't know, something like that. Okay, so he explains that the Torah never wants to say something that's false. All right, the Torah is a book of truth. It's entirely true, every word of it. It never wants to say anything false. Now, if the idolater realizes that they're wrong, so then the Torah will quote what they said in order to show how they discovered that they're wrong. So in Moshe's case, when he had the fight with the magicians in Egypt, they acknowledged that they're wrong, right? Everybody eventually saw that they were wrong. So that's why the Torah quotes what they said in order to show you that they were wrong. And they themselves admitted that they were wrong. But Abraham's idolaters never admitted that they were wrong, right? At no point in the story did they ever say, okay, you're right. As the Ramban explained, they said Avram's just a magician. They never said that there's only one God. So any idolater who doesn't see the truth, the Torah doesn't want to quote what they have to say. All right, that's one way to say it. The Torah does not quote people who continued in their error and never saw that they were wrong. All right, that's number one. A second way to say this is, there's another commentary, the Hadri Kodesh. All right, and he says that the Torah will tell you a story with what the idolater said if there's a point to the story, right? In other words, if there's a bigger point to the whole story, so the Torah wants to give you the important parts of the story, and part of the story is that the idolater said something wrong. So the Torah will put that in there because it's part of the whole story. It's relevant to the whole story. But in this case, it's not, the story is irrelevant, right? There's no point to this story other than to show you that the idolaters were wrong. The whole point of the story is that Abraham defeated the idolaters. But there's no other point to the story. There's no broader meaning to the story. There's no historical lesson to the story other than that the idolaters were wrong. So in that case, the Torah doesn't want to record the story because it has to record what the idolaters had to say. All right, so that's the difference. If there's another reason to tell the story, then the Torah will. But if it's just what the idolaters said, then the Torah is not interested. Okay. So either way, that's the Ramban's explanation for why the Torah never mentioned the story, because it doesn't want to get into what the idolater said. And now, says the Ramban, this is going to answer the first question. Why didn't the Torah tell us about Abraham, who he was, why he was chosen? So the answer is because Abraham was this tremendous, tremendous person already by the time he was chosen. Think about all the things he had done. He had spread God's name in a pagan society where they were very, very angry about him, right? He had made a lot of enemies. They tried to kill him. They drove him out of town. I mean, Abraham had suffered a lot in order to spread knowledge about God, right? So Abraham is not just some random guy that God chooses. Abraham was already a well-established person who was busy promoting God's name in the world. So when God chose him, there was nothing random about this situation, right? He had earned it. He deserved it. He had been willing to die for God. He had been willing to suffer for God. You know, he had done so much, and he deserved to be chosen to start the Jewish people. But the Torah didn't want to tell us any of that story because, again, it didn't want to get into the whole issue of what the idolaters were saying. It wasn't interested in the views of the idolaters. So the Torah skipped the reason why Abraham was chosen, and it just went straight to the main point of the story, which is that Abraham spread the name of God in the world. All right. So that's the Ramban's reason. That's his reading of this whole story. Right now, I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example. Sometimes, let's say I'm giving a class, I make a mistake. So the next time I'm talking about that subject, right, I don't go back and correct it. I just tell everyone I made a mistake. But to go back and start explaining the mistake is a lot of times more confusing than just moving on. All right. It's like, in other words, I correct what I said, but without making a big deal about what point I was wrong about. So it's the same thing here. I would use that as an example at what the Torah is doing. It just wants to move on with the story of Abraham, right? Abraham is about to create this beautiful nation. He's going to teach the world about God. He's going to teach the world that there's one God. The Torah doesn't want to start getting into all the details about all the pagans and all the idolaters and all the this and the that. It just wants to get on with the real story, which is Abraham and his legacy. And it doesn't want to get bogged down in what happened and all the mistakes that were made. All right. So that's the Ramban's approach. Now, the key point that I just want to take out for us, there's a lot of interesting stuff here. But for us, the key point I want to point out is that according to the Ramban, Abraham was chosen for a reason. He was deserving of it. He had lived his life in a way that he deserved to start the Jewish people, and that's why he was chosen. Okay, now let's go to the Maharal. All right, the Maharal says the opposite of the Ramban. He quotes the Ramban's question, and then he says the exact opposite. He says, you know what? The Torah never told us anything about Abraham because it doesn't want us to think that Abraham was chosen for a reason. The Torah wants to make it clear that God chose Abraham and he chose the Jewish people totally unconditionally for no reason. And he compares this, right? How does the Torah begin describing Noach? First, it says the Noach matza chen be'enei Hashem, that Noach found favor in the eyes of God. So, and then God appears to him. So first it says that Noach was a good guy. So what does that mean? It means Noach's relationship with God was conditional. God liked him because he was a good guy. The Torah does not want us to think that Abraham was chosen because he was a good guy. The Torah wants to stress that Abraham, Yeah, please. The Torah wants to stress that Abraham was chosen for no reason at all. It was totally unconditional, the choosing of the Jewish people. And the reason is because if the Jewish people were chosen for a reason, then what does that mean? It means that if we sin or if we're not the good guys anymore, so then we might end up in a situation where God no longer chooses us. God no longer loves us. So the Torah wanted to stress that God will never abandon us because his choice of us had nothing to do with the fact that we're good guys. He chose us because he loves us, because he chose us. And therefore, no matter what we do, no matter how much we sin, God will never abandon us. So that's why the Torah never says anything about how Abraham was such a good guy, even though he was a good guy, because the Torah is trying to stress that the choice of Abraham was not dependent on him being a good guy. It was purely because God chose him and his nation to be the chosen people. All right, and that's why, according to the Maharal, it doesn't mention the whole story of the fire, the fire that Abraham was thrown into the fire, because it doesn't want to tell us anything about Abraham, about all his, sacrifice for God. It doesn't want to mention that. If the Torah told us the story of the furnace that Abraham was thrown in the fire, then again, we might think, you know what, Abraham was chosen because of that. So the Torah skips it, it omits it, so that we never will think that God chose Abraham because of anything he had done. And again, it stresses that we're the chosen people for all time, no matter what we do. All right, so that's the Maharal and the Ramban's debate over here.
It sounds like Christian theology.
Wait, one second. Let me just finish up two more lines, and then I'm going to come back to you. Okay, let me just finish up 2 points. According to the Ramban and the Maharal, okay, this is a very interesting debate. Why did God choose the Jews? Right, and like I said, there's that line that God didn't choose the Jews chose God. Right, so that's a debate now. The Ramban holds that the Jews chose God. Abraham chose God first, and then God chose him.
Yeah.
Maharal says that God just chose Abraham. It was totally unconditional. It was for no reason. All right, so this is a very interesting debate. Obviously, the Maharal, it's hard for us to connect with the Maharal's view because why should God have chosen the Jews, right? In other words, why did we merit this, right? It doesn't explain why we got it. So it's a little bit difficult to understand that. Let me just add one more point to the Maharal. The Maharal also believes that the giving of the Torah, right? When God gave the Jews the Torah, so the rabbis say that he forced the Jews to accept the Torah. So the Maharal has a very similar comment, which is he says that it had to be forced, because if God had offered it to the Jews and they took it voluntarily, so then it wouldn't be as good, as solid an acceptance of the Torah as if it was forced. All right, anything that's forced is more lasting than if it's done voluntarily. So this is a very similar idea, right? Again, the Maharal saying that God chose the Jews in a totally unconditional way, and the Jews then accepted the Torah in a coerced way. So this is a long-lasting, eternal bond that can never be broken. All right, so that's our debate for tonight, and I think it's an interesting one. All right, let me